There are truths in Imperium that do not scream. They do not announce themselves with warp storms or demonic incursions or the crack of exterminators' orders. They exist quietly, buried beneath 10,000 years of prayer, repetition, and carefully maintained ignorance. Somewhere beneath the gilded vaults of Terra, beneath the chanting of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the eternal vigil of the Adeptus Custodes, there is a silence that does not belong. Not the silence of reverence, nor the silence of death, but the silence of an agreement being honored long after anyone remembers its terms. The Emperor of Mankind is worshipped as the last, perfect bulwark against the dark. Yet the Imperium itself is built on pacts, compromises, and bargains struck in desperation. The question that has haunted the oldest data slate fragments and the most heretical whispers is not whether the Emperor made sacrifices to save humanity, but whether one of those sacrifices was never meant to be seen at all. Because if the Golden Throne is not merely a prison or a life support engine, but part of an arrangement older than the Imperium itself, then the fate of humanity may have been decided the moment the bargain was sealed. Before we descend any further into this forbidden history, if you value deep, lore-accurate Warhammer 40K storytelling that treats the Imperium with the gravity it deserves, consider supporting the channel by liking the video, sharing it with fellow lore pilgrims, and subscribing. These stories survive only because they are remembered, and memory is the Imperium's last defense against oblivion. The age before the Imperium did not feel like legend to those who lived through it. It felt like hunger. It felt like cities burning for reasons no one could remember anymore, and machines worshipped because understanding them had been lost. Terra during the final centuries of Old Night was not a throne world waiting to be claimed. It was a scarred planet choking on its own ruins, its skies stained by ancient wars and its continents fractured into techno-barbarian dominions that ruled by force, ritual, and fear. Humanity had not fallen in a single moment. It had eroded, knowledge thinned, trust vanished. Warp storms isolated star systems until the idea of a united species became a myth whispered by madmen and archivists. Survival was local, brutal, and temporary. In that world, ideals were luxuries. Only outcomes mattered. The Emperor emerged into this landscape not as a god, but as a solution. That distinction matters more than imperial doctrine is comfortable admitting. He did not announce himself with miracles meant to inspire worship. He acted with precision, speed, and an understanding of human weakness that bordered on surgical. Armies bent the knee not because they believed, but because resistance collapsed too efficiently to be coincidence. Warlords who had ruled for generations were undone in weeks, their defenses failing at critical moments, their alliances unraveling at precisely the wrong time. To later chroniclers, this became proof of inevitable destiny. To those who were there, it felt like pressure closing from every side at once, leaving no space to breathe, let alone fight back. Even then, the Emperor did not claim omnipotence. He spoke of unity, of reason, of a future where humanity would no longer be prey to the warp or its own superstition. But behind those words lay calculation. Terra could be conquered by force, yes, but a galaxy could not. Warp travel was unreliable, fractured by storms that no amount of conventional power could command. Psykers emerged unpredictably, tearing holes in reality or burning themselves out under forces they could not comprehend. Humanity needed more than weapons. It needed structure imposed on chaos itself. The problem was that chaos does not yield to command. It yields only to leverage. Fragments from this era survive only in damaged form. Early Mechanicum data vaults contain references to projects abruptly reclassified, their explanatory segments excised with thoroughness that suggests retroactive fear. Custodian records from the Unification Wars speak of victories that hinge on moments no tactician could fully explain. Enemy psykers failing simultaneously, warp phenomena collapsing at the precise instant Imperial forces required passage, entire resistance networks unraveling after a single unseen disruption. These are not described as miracles. They are described as anomalies, noted and then deliberately ignored. Patterns emerge only when one commits the heresy of comparing them. The Emperor understood the warp not as a realm of superstition, but as a system governed by rules humanity did not yet possess the language to define. He also understood that systems respond to pressure, to exchange. Power drawn from nowhere always leaves absence behind. In later ages, Imperial scholars would argue endlessly about whether the Emperor mastered the warp or merely resisted it. What they rarely ask is whether mastery was ever the objective. Survival often requires negotiation with forces that do not care whether you live, only that the balance is maintained. There are moments in the historical record where the narrative fractures, not breaks, fractures. A campaign concludes too cleanly. A warp storm recedes without precedent. A psychic catastrophe resolves itself before reaching critical mass. In each case, the official explanation attributes success to planning, discipline, or the Emperor's unmatched intellect. Yet the same records show contingency preparations that were never used, fallback positions that should have been activated but were not needed. It is as if something intervened before failure could become visible, not dramatically, quietly, like a hand adjusting a scale just before it tips. No text from this era states that a bargain was made. That absence is itself suspicious. The Imperium is not subtle about glorifying sacrifice. It catalogs martyrdom with obsessive devotion. It records loss as proof of righteousness. If the Emperor had paid a visible price during Unification, it would have been sanctified, ritualized, carved into the foundation myths of the Imperium. Instead, what we find are gaps. Long intervals where the Emperor withdrew from public command. Projects begun and then sealed. Entire strata of early Imperial history classified so completely that even the Inquisition treats them as voids rather than secrets. It is here that the idea of a pact first appears, not as doctrine, but as inference. Something aided humanity's consolidation when it should not have been possible. That aid did not come freely, because nothing of that magnitude ever does. And whatever price was agreed upon was structured to be paid slowly, invisibly, over millennia rather than in a single catastrophic moment. A delayed cost is easier to accept, easier to forget, especially when generations pass believing the danger has already been overcome. The Emperor never spoke publicly of such matters, and perhaps that was the most telling sign of all. He warned relentlessly against the warp, against gods, against the false comfort of bargains with powers beyond human comprehension. That warning reads differently when viewed through the lens of experience rather than ideology. It does not sound like ignorance. It sounds like regret or restraint. The voice of someone who has already looked too closely at what answers back. When the universe is pressed hard enough, by the time Terra was unified, the pattern had been set. Humanity advanced behind an unseen buffer, protected not by invincibility, but by timing that never quite failed. The Great Crusade would expand this pattern across the stars, but its foundation was laid here, in a broken world stitched together too quickly for chance alone to explain. The Imperium would call this destiny. Others might call it momentum, but momentum, once borrowed, must eventually be repaid. The earliest records of the Great Crusade read like a triumphal march, but the living reality of it was not triumph. It was strain. For every compliant world that opened its gates in awe, there were 10 that resisted out of fear, pride, or the simple inability to understand what was happening. Whole civilizations had grown in isolation. Their cultures bent around local survival, their myths filled with warnings about strangers descending from the void. When imperial envoys arrived carrying the imperial Aquila and the promise of unity, they were often met not with celebration, but with weapons and prayers of their own. Compliance was not a single act. It was a process, a grinding conversion of the human spirit into something that could be standardized. The Emperor's genius was never only military. It was architectural. He built systems that could scale beyond him, because he understood that even his own presence could not be everywhere at once. The legions of Astartes were not merely soldiers. They were instruments of inevitability. The Astra Militarum would later become the Imperium's vast grinding engine, but in those early years, every campaign still depended on fragile things. Fuel convoys, astropathic communication, the uncertain blessing of warp travel. An army can be perfect and still be stranded if the void refuses passage. Entire fleets can be lost if the warp decides to twist a corridor between stars into a grave. And yet, again and again, Imperial forces arrived when they needed to. Not always easily, not always without loss, but with consistency that made the impossible seem routine. Navigators spoke of currents that seemed apart, not like storms calming, but like storms shifting aside. Astropaths describe messages that should have scattered into madness arriving intact, as if something had allowed them through. Adeptus Mechanicus data logs noted fluctuations in Geller field stability that did not match any known engineering cause. Moments where the barrier between real space and the immaterium held longer than its tolerances predicted. These observations were usually filed, flagged, and then buried beneath layers of sanctified bureaucracy. The Imperium does not like unexplained success. It prefers success to be earned in ways it can preach. In the private spaces, however, behind sealed doors, within the quiet dread of those whose duty placed them near forbidden mechanisms, another tone emerges. A tone that suggests the Emperor was not merely pushing against the warp, but holding something in place, not conquering it, containing it. There is a difference between locking a door and leaning your full weight against it, because you can feel something on the other side testing the hinges. Rumor, in the Imperium, is not casual. It is a form of contraband. In some places it spreads as superstition, in others as coded prayer, and in the most dangerous circles it spreads as a kind of mathematics, the attempt to explain outcomes that do not align with known rules. In those circles, the story of a pact does not begin with the Golden Throne, because the throne comes later. It begins earlier, with a single premise, that the Emperor's war against the warp was never fought with pure rejection. It was fought with leverage, and leverage implies a counterpart. Some frame it as a necessity born of old night. They say that when humanity was cut off, when the warp storms made a galaxy impossible to cross, the Emperor sought a way to reopen the paths, not by worshipping the warp, not by surrendering to it, but by forcing it to behave, by buying time from something that does not perceive time the way humans do. Others interpret it through the language of prophecy, that the Emperor, seeing the long arc of human extinction, chose to bind himself to an oath that will hold the darkness back at the cost of his own freedom. The most heretical whisper suggests something even colder, that the Pact was not a moral sacrifice, but a transaction, and humanity was a currency. None of these versions can be proven. That is part of their power. In the Imperium, truth is not always what is most evidenced. Truth is what survives. The Pact story survives because it explains a particular kind of dread that too many people have felt in different eras, in different forms, without ever meeting one another. A custodian standing in a silent corridor beneath the Imperial Palace, feeling the air tighten for a fraction of a heartbeat. A tech priest hearing a note in the throne's machinery that does not belong to any human-made system. A navigator waking with their third eye aching as if it stared at something that stared back. The Emperor's official relationship to worship was rejection. He forbade it, crushed it, attempted to replace it with the imperial truth. Yet the warp does not respond to rationality. It responds to belief, emotion, and the weight of collective psychic pressure. The Emperor was too intelligent not to know this, which raises a question that makes the mind recoil. If belief is a tool in the warp, and the Emperor forbade belief in gods, what did he intend humanity to believe in instead? Himself? Reason? Unity? Or something more subtle? A singular, directed conviction that could be shaped into a weapon without being called faith? It is possible, only as a rumor spoken in the language of uncertainty, that the Emperor did not merely resist the warp. He exploited the laws that govern it, not by kneeling, but by setting terms. But a term is still an agreement. A rule is still a boundary, and boundaries, once established, become lines that can be crossed in both directions. The Pact, in these whispers, is not a spoken contract. It is an arrangement woven into reality itself, an exchange of pressures, a promise made not in words, but in structure. The Emperor builds an Imperium that will feed a mechanism, and the mechanism will hold open a path, keep a light burning, maintain a barrier that would otherwise fail. Humanity believes it is surviving because it is strong. It survives because the arrangement continues. The horrifying part is that survival, under those conditions, is not freedom. It is compliance. This is why the earliest hints of the Golden Throne feel less like invention and more like inevitability. As Terra rose from the ashes of old night, as the Emperor's armies conquered, as the Imperial Palace expanded into a continent-spanning labyrinth, something else was being prepared beneath it, not in the open, not for celebration, but in sealed vaults where even names were dangerous. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not simply build a throne. They assembled a machine cathedral designed to do something no other device in human history was meant to do: anchor a being of impossible psychic magnitude while forcing reality to remain intact around him. If the Emperor was only a ruler, the throne would be excessive. If he was only a psyker, the throne would be redundant. But if he was a keystone in an arrangement that held the Imperium's survival at bay, then the throne becomes something else entirely. Not a seat, not a life support engine, a lock. By the time the Imperium's enemies truly closed in, by the time betrayal shattered unity and the war became inward rather than outward, the stage was already set. The Pact, whatever it was, had created momentum that could not be stopped without collapse. Even the Emperor could not simply step away. And when the moment arrived that demanded he be bound to the throne, it did not feel like a sudden tragedy. It felt like a mechanism reaching its intended conclusion. What no imperial record ever answers, and what every whisper circles, is the same question. When the Emperor was placed upon the golden throne, was it because he was dying, or because the arrangement required him to be there? The Heresy did not arrive like an unexpected storm. In retrospect, it reads more like a system finally pushed beyond the tolerances it had been quietly maintaining for decades. Unity on that scale had always been brittle. The Primarchs were weapons shaped like demigods, forged to impose order on a galaxy that resisted being ordered, and each of them carried fragments of the Emperors that were never meant to exist independently. When betrayal came, it did not only break armies and fleets. It fractured the architecture of the Emperor's design. Lines of pressure that had once been distributed across the Great Crusade collapsed inward, forcing everything back toward Terra. During the siege, the Golden Throne ceased to be a theoretical contingency and became the axis upon which reality itself strained. The Emperor's presence, already immense, was forced into a constant state of exertion. He was no longer merely commanding or guiding. He was holding. The warp around Terra did not behave as it should have under such concentrated psychic violence. Instead of tearing the system apart, it compressed, thickened, as if constrained by an unseen framework. The Astronomican burned with steadiness that bordered on unnatural given the scale of the conflict. For the Imperium, this was salvation. For those close enough to feel it, it was something else. The sensation of a structure groaning under weight it was never meant to bear indefinitely. Accounts from this period are heavily filtered, but even in their sense of form they carry a distinct anxiety. Custodians reported shifts in the air near the throne, moments where their instincts screamed, without a visible cause. Tech priests recorded oscillations in the throne systems that could not be resolved through maintenance or prayer. Astropaths collapsed in fits, raving not about demons or betrayal, but about a presence that felt vast, patient, and attentive. These incidents were logged, classified, and ritualized into acceptable interpretations. The Imperium survives by turning terror into doctrine. When the Emperor was finally interred within the Golden Throne, the act was framed as an emergency measure, a last resort to preserve his life after wounds no mortal body could endure. That explanation is sufficient on the surface. It is also incomplete. The throne was not activated hastily. Its integration with the Emperor was seamless, precise, as if both had been prepared for the state long before the siege reached its crescendo. Systems aligned, psychic conduits stabilized. The machine accepted him in a way that suggests compatibility rather than improvisation. From that moment onward, the nature of the Emperor's sacrifice changed. He was no longer simply a wounded ruler sustained by technology. He became a fixed point. The Astronomican, now bound permanently to his presence, cast its light across the warp with relentless regularity. Warp travel stabilized enough to hold the Imperium together despite its vastness. But stabilization is not neutrality. Something was being held back, something that pressed constantly against the Emperor's will, testing the limits of endurance that no biological being, however augmented, should possess. In the centuries that followed, the Imperium adapted to this new normal with horrifying efficiency. The Emperor's silence was reframed as divine mystery. His suffering became holy. The daily sacrifice of psykers to the throne was institutionalized, justified as necessary fuel. Few asked why such fuel was required in perpetuity, rather than diminishing over time. Fewer still asked where that energy ultimately went. In the Imperium, function replaces curiosity. As long as the light burns, the The mechanism is considered righteous, and yet subtle shifts continued. The throne did not merely consume, it redistributed. Adeptus Mechanicus adepts began to notice that certain subsystems behaved less like drains and more like regulators, adjusting flows rather than simply burning them away. The Emperor's psychic output did not fluctuate randomly. It responded to pressure, to absence, to events unfolding far from Terra that should not have been able to affect a bound mind. It was as if the throne was mediating an exchange rather than sustaining a corpse. This is where the idea of the Pact becomes most unsettling, because it reframes the Emperor's current state not as a tragic end, but as ongoing participation. If the arrangement made during Old Night required a constant anchor, a consciousness vast enough to interface with something beyond the warp's usual predators, then the Golden Throne is not merely life support. It is the payment schedule. The Emperor endures because endurance is the cost of keeping the arrangement intact. Those who appeared too closely into the throne's workings, Inquisitors who vanished, Magi whose logic engines were quietly dismantled, often reached the same conclusion before they were silenced. The throne does not exist to preserve the Emperor. The Emperor exists to preserve what the throne is preventing. And what it prevents is not chaos in the abstract, but specific imbalance that would occur if the arrangement were allowed to fail. The Imperium tells its people that if the Emperor dies, humanity dies with him. That may be true, but it avoids a more terrifying possibility, that if the Emperor is ever freed, if the Pact is ever broken, the thing that has been waiting on the other side of the agreement will finally be allowed to collect what is owed, not in the form of annihilation, but in reclamation, a correction to a debt that has been deferred for 10,000 years. By the late Imperium, cracks in the system become harder to ignore. The throne requires more psykers, not fewer. The Astronomican flickers during periods of galactic upheaval. Warp storms behave with increasing intent, as if responding to changes in pressure rather than random fluctuation. Each of these signs is treated as an isolated crisis. Together, they form a pattern that mirrors the earliest days of the Emperor's rise, when unexplained aid first appeared. The Pact, if it exists, has not ended. It has matured. By the time 10,000 years had passed, the Imperium no longer remembered how to recognize a bargain. It remembered only obedience. What began as a calculated act of survival had been ritualized into dogma, so completely that questioning it felt like treason against reality itself. The Emperor on the Golden Throne became less a participant in history, and more a feature of the universe, like gravity or death. He was simply there, always there, and anything that had always existed was assumed to be natural. But systems built on denial do not decay quietly. They erode in ways that force themselves into notice. The Golden Throne's demands increase not in dramatic leaps, but in steady increments that could be justified one requisition order at a time. A few more psykers per cycle, a few more emergency sanctifications, a few more prayers added to the litany of sustenance. Each change small enough to be absorbed, none alarming enough to provoke reconsideration. The Adeptus Mechanicus recorded these increases as load adjustments, never as warnings. The Imperium does not ask why a machine grows hungrier. It asks only how to feed it. Those closest to the throne felt the change first, not as visions, but as weight. Custodians began to report a pressure in their thoughts during extended vigils, a sense that the air itself resisted movement. Tech priests noticed that maintenance rites took longer to complete, not because the machine resisted repair, but because it responded as though compensating for external stress. Astropaths bound to the Astronomican experienced moments of vertigo when focusing its light, as if the beacon were not simply shining outward, but holding something back from pushing inward. These experiences were never described the same way twice, yet they shared a core sensation, a tension, the unsettling feeling that something vast was not merely present, but aware of the effort being exerted to deny it. Not anger, not hunger, patience. The kind of patience that belongs to forces for whom 10,000 years is not an eternity, but an interval. The Emperor's silence, once interpreted as divine mystery, began to feel increasingly like strain. Not weakness, but expenditure. If he had once been the architect of the Pact, he was now its keystone, bearing the accumulated weight of every delayed consequence. His consciousness, stretched across the throne's mechanisms, and the Astronomican projection no longer moved freely. It held, and holding is not passive. It is work that never ends. This reframes the Imperium's greatest fear. The terror is not that the Emperor might finally die. It is that he might no longer be able to continue. That the arrangement forged in desperation during Old Night was never meant to last forever. Only long enough for humanity to become strong enough to stand without it. If that was the original intention, then something has gone terribly wrong. Humanity did not grow out of the Pact. It built an empire around it. It made dependencies sacred. And so the debt remains, deferred, compounded. Every soul fed into the throne is another payment made on a balance no one alive remembers agreeing to. Every prayer reinforces a structure of belief that keeps the system stable. Even as it deepens the trap, the Emperor does not scream. He does not protest. He endures. And endurance at this scale is indistinguishable from imprisonment. Chapter 1 ends not with revelation, but with a realization that spreads slowly, like cold through stone. Whatever bargain was made to save humanity did not end with victory. It did not end with a great crusade. It did not even end with the Emperor's entombment upon the golden throne. It continues moment by moment, sacrifice by sacrifice, in a form so normalized that most of the Imperium cannot imagine existence without it. And beneath Terra, beneath gold and incense and unending prayer, something waits in perfect stillness, not because it's been defeated, but because the terms are still being met. Terra is not rule from the sky. That is a lie told to pilgrims who glimpse the spires of the Imperial Palace and believe power flows downward from gold and height and light. The truth is buried. It presses upward from below, from depths sealed so completely that even language fails to map them properly. Beneath the palace's outer sanctums, beneath the halls where the Adeptus Custodes stand immobile for centuries at a time, there exists a descending architecture of denial. Corridors narrow, materials change. Gold gives way to black and adamantium, then composites whose origins are no longer fully understood. Here, the Imperium does not celebrate. It contains. Those who serve in these depths learn quickly that the Golden Throne is not a single object. It is a system layered atop older systems, many of which were never meant to be seen together. Adeptus Mechanicus writes describe it as a holy union of machine and flesh, but that description collapses under proximity. The throne hums with conflicting intentions. Some components draw power inward, others regulate flow, others still do neither, existing solely to maintain boundaries that cannot be measured by conventional means. The longer one studies it, the clearer it becomes that it was not designed merely to sustain life. It was designed to keep something stable. The Custodian Guard understand this without words. Their vigil is not ceremonial, no matter how it appears to outsiders. It is functional. They are placed where they are because human presence still matters near the throne. Flesh anchors reality in ways machinery cannot. A custodian standing motionless for decades is not guarding against assassins or invasions. He is part of the structure. His discipline, his will, his absolute absence of doubt contribute to a psychic environment where deviation is minimized. Even their silence serves a purpose. Noise introduces variables. Variables invite response. Below them, the Adeptus Mechanicus labor endlessly, performing rites that resemble maintenance only in the most superficial sense. They do not repair the throne so much as negotiate with it. Each adjustment is accompanied by caution, because no one fully understands which subsystem is original, and which was added later in response to pressures that emerged after the Emperor was bound. Logic engines run projections that never quite close, their equations resolving into margins of error that grow rather than shrink. These results are archived, flagged, and sealed. The machine god does not demand comprehension. It demands function. The sacrifices begin far from these halls. Psykers are gathered across the Imperium, cataloged, transported, and prepared long before they ever see Terra. By the time they reach the palace, most are already hollowed by fear, indoctrination, and exhaustion. They are told they will serve the Emperor. They are not told how. The Imperium does not lie unnecessarily. It simply omits. When their psychic essence is drawn into the throne systems, it does not vanish instantly. It is processed, modulated, redirected. This is not the consumption of fuel in a furnace. It is the feeding of a circuit. Astropaths who survive their binding to the Astronomican describe a moment of unbearable pressure just before the light stabilizes. A sensation like standing between two immense forces, one behind them, one ahead, both pulling. The Astronomican does not merely illuminate the warp. It defines a corridor within it, a region of force coherence that resists the warp's natural turbulence. That resistance has a cost. The throne absorbs a strain, channeling it to the Emperor's bound consciousness, dispersing it through structures that were never intended to bear such load indefinitely. In rare moments, the system falters. Not catastrophically. Not yet. There are fluctuations in output that cannot be traced to mechanical failure or psychic shortage. During these moments, those present report the same phenomenon, a deepening of silence. Sound dampens, thought slows. Even the omnipresent hum of the throne seems to pause, as if listening. These incidents are classified as sanctified anomalies, logged under doctrines that discourage further inquiry. The Imperium has learned that naming a thing gives it shape, and shape invites attention. What is most disturbing is not that the throne requires constant input, but that it appears to respond to external conditions. During major warp upheavals, its internal pressures spike. During galaxy-wide crises, its demand for psychic reinforcement increases. This suggests correlation rather than coincidence. The throne is not operating in isolation. It is part of a larger equilibrium, reacting to forces beyond Terra in ways that imply ongoing negotiation rather than static defense. The Emperor, bound within this mechanism, does not sleep. He cannot. His consciousness is stretched thin, distributed across pathways that intersect real space and the immaterium simultaneously. If he once perceived the warp as a field to be shaped, he now experiences it as proximity, constant, unavoidable. He does not rule from the throne. He endures it, and endurance at this scale becomes indistinguishable from participation. The Imperium insists that the throne preserves the Emperor. The evidence suggests the opposite. The Emperor preserves the throne's function. He is the stabilizing element that allows incompatible systems to coexist without tearing reality apart. Remove him, and the machinery does not simply shut down. It destabilizes. The lock fails. Whatever pressure has been held at bay is no longer constrained by the Emperor's will. This is why Terra is guarded with such fanatic intensity. Not because the Emperor might be assassinated, but because interruption of the system, even briefly, could have consequences that propagate outward faster than any fleet could respond. Terra is not merely a capital. It is a containment site. Those who grasp this truth do not speak of rebellion or despair. They speak of maintenance, of continuity, of keeping the system running one more day, one more year, one more millennium. The question of whether the arrangement should exist has long since been rendered irrelevant by dependence. The Imperium no longer asks what the throne is for. It asks what happens if it ever stops. The deeper one descends beneath the Imperial Palace, the more the idea of holiness erodes into something colder and more precise. There are chambers where prayer is forbidden, not because it is heretical, but because it interferes. Thought itself becomes regulated. Servitors patrol corridors not to deter intrusion, but to ensure consistency. Their blank gazes and perfectly repeated movements enforcing a rhythm that living minds might unconsciously disrupt. Here, the Imperium does not express faith. It enforces stability. The Adeptus Custodes understand that their presence is not symbolic. Each of them has been psychically engineered to resist not only corruption, but deviation. Their minds are anchors, heavy and immovable. When they stand vigil, they are not merely guarding the Emperor's body. They are reinforcing the boundaries around him, dampening fluctuations that could cascade outward to the throne systems. A custodian who falters, who doubts, who allows uncertainty to root itself even briefly, becomes a liability. This is why their training is absolute. It is not loyalty that matters here. It is consistency. Tech priests assigned to the throne's inner sanctums rarely serve long. Not because the work is dangerous in conventional sense, but because prolonged exposure produces changes that cannot be categorized as mechanical failure or spiritual corruption. Some lose the ability to dream. Others begin to hear patterns in the throne's hum that persist even when they are removed from the chamber. A few develop an aversion to silence, as if quiet itself threatens to pull them back into alignment with something vast and impersonal. These individuals are reassigned, retired, or quietly dismantled if their symptoms persist. The machine god values function over curiosity. What none of them are told, but many eventually infer, is that the throne is not only responding to strain, it is communicating it, not in words, not even in images, but in pressure gradients that propagate through psychic-sensitive minds. The Emperor absorbs the greatest share of this pressure, but he does not absorb it alone. The throne distributes it across everything connected to it, from the Astronomican's projection to the smallest regulatory node buried kilometers beneath Terra's crust. Every connected component feels a fraction of the weight, enough to influence behavior without fully revealing cause. This distribution is deliberate. Systems designed to bear infinite load collapse. Systems designed to shared endure. The throne was built to endure, and endurance requires participation. There are records, suppressed, incomplete, of attempts to isolate the Emperor from certain subsystems, usually during periods of crisis when the throne's demands threaten to exceed available resources. Each attempt ended the same way. The Astronomican destabilized. Warp traffic spiked with losses. Astropathic messages degraded into incoherence. Within hours, the changes were reversed. The lesson was learned quickly and enforced absolutely. The Emperor cannot be separated from the system without consequences that ripple across the Imperium faster than any political authority can contain. This is where the nature of the Pact becomes clearest, not as theology, but as engineering logic. Whatever was arranged during humanity's darkest hour did not rely on trust or benevolence. It relied on structure, on feedback loops, on consequences that manifest immediately when terms are violated. The Emperor's role is not that of worship God, but of a regulator holding incompatible realities apart. He is the variable that allows the equation to resolve without catastrophe. And yet, even regulators were down. The throne's hunger has increased steadily across the millennia, not exponentially, but predictably. As the galaxy fractures, as warp storms intensify, as belief itself becomes more polarized and extreme, the load placed on the Emperor grows heavier. The Imperium responds by feeding the system more aggressively, never questioning whether the increased demand is a symptom rather than a requirement. In doing so, it reinforces the underlying pattern. Pressure answer with sacrifice, sacrifice answer with temporary stability. There are moments, rare and brief, when the throne's output surges beyond expected parameters. During these moments, the Astronomican burns with unnatural clarity. Warp routes stabilize in regions that should be impassable. Entire campaigns succeed against impossible odds. These are celebrated as miracles. They are recorded as proof of the Emperor's undying power. But within the throne's inner sanctums, such surges are met with fear, because they are always followed by correction, a deeper silence, a sharper increase in demand, as if something has noticed the imbalance and adjusted the terms accordingly. This is the danger of a deferred bargain. It creates the illusion of control while quietly removing it. Humanity believes it commands a throne because it can feed it. In reality, it is responding to signals it does not understand, mistaking compliance for mastery. The Emperor remains bound at the center of this exchange, his will stretched thin across layers of machinery, ritual, and belief. He does not direct the Imperium anymore. He stabilizes it. And stabilization, when prolonged beyond its intended span, becomes stasis. A state where change is resisted not because it is dangerous, but because it would expose the system's true cost. Chapter 2 drifts towards its end not with catastrophe, but with recognition. Terra is not merely the heart of the Imperium. It is the pressure point upon which the survival of the species rests. The Golden Throne does not protect humanity from the warp out of benevolence or faith. It enforces an arrangement whose original justification has been buried beneath 10,000 years of obedience. And beneath the palace, beneath the throne, beneath even the Emperor's bound consciousness, the system waits for the moment when endurance is no longer sufficient to satisfy the balance it was built to maintain. The Imperium has always trusted patterns more than explanations. When something works, it is sanctified. When it fails, it is purged. What it does not tolerate is ambiguity that persists. And yet, Across the millennia following the Emperor's entombment, ambiguity became impossible to ignore. Not loudly, not all at once. It surfaced in fragments, in reports that contradicted doctrine without ever openly defying it. The Imperium did not collapse under these contradictions. It learned to live with them. That adaptation may have been its most dangerous evolution. The first signs appeared far from Terra, where the Astronomican's light thinned at the edges of known space. Navigators began to describe regions of the warp where the beacon did not fade gradually, but warped around something unseen. The light bent, curved, or dimmed in patterns that defied the accepted models taught by the novice Nobilite. These reports were dismissed as individual strain or mutation. Navigators are tolerated precisely because they are unstable. Their testimony is convenient to doubt. But when the same descriptions emerged independently across generations and bloodlines, denial required effort. Astropaths followed. Messages sent along established routes arrived altered in subtle but consistent ways. Not corrupted in the usual sense, not filled with demonic intrusion or madness, but compressed. Words lost emotional resonance. Urgency flattened. In extreme cases, entire messages arrived intact but felt wrong to their recipients, stripped of context they should have carried. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica categorized these incidents as transmission degradation. Yet logic engines failed to correlate them with distance, interference, or known warp phenomena. The signal was not being disrupted. It was being reshaped. On the battlefield, commanders noticed something more troubling. Certain wars did not unfold according to probability. Entire crusades succeeded where logistics, attrition, and enemy capability predicted failure. At first, this was celebrated as proof of imperial righteousness. But over time, a pattern emerged. These victories often occurred in regions where the warp was unusually volatile, where reality itself seemed stretched thin. The Imperium did not conquer despite instability. It conquered because instability behaved in ways that favored survival, just enough to prevent collapse, never enough to secure peace. The Adeptus Mechanicus encountered the problem in data rather than doctrine. Predictive models began returning margins of error that grew instead of narrowing as more information was added. The more data fed into the system, the less confident the outcome became. This was not ignorance. It was resistance, as if the future itself refused to resolve cleanly under observation. Magi who pressed the issue too far found their projections terminated by higher authority. Their cogitators seized for recalibration that never returned them. The Inquisition inevitably noticed, or rather, certain inquisitors did. Those whose mandate allowed them to compare sealed archives across centuries began to see echoes, the same anomalies recurring under different names, the same corrective events following moments of imperial overextension, worlds saved at the last possible moment, then left spiritually hollow, systems stabilized, then drained of something harder to quantify than population or resources. These inquisitors rarely died heroically. They vanished, reassigned, silenced, or convinced through experiences they never documented that some questions are more dangerous than any enemy. What disturbed them most was not the existence of anomalies, but their timing. Every significant deviation aligned with periods of stress centered on Terra. When the throne's demand spiked, the galaxy responded. When the Astronomican faltered, reality elsewhere compensated in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The Imperium treated each event as isolated. The pattern only emerged when one committed the unforgivable act of synthesis. Among the navigators, a forbidden concept circulated quietly, that the Astronomican was not merely a beacon but constraint, not just a light to follow, but a pressure field that shaped the warp's behavior within a vast radius. In this view, the warp did not obey imperial will. It reacted to imposed structure, and reactions, over time, produced counterpressure. This would explain why warp storms intensified rather than diminished as the Imperium expanded. The more order imposed, the more force accumulated at the boundaries. The idea never reached public doctrine. It survived as a heresy of implication rather than statement. If true, it meant the Imperium's greatest achievement was also its greatest provocation, that the Pact, whatever its original intent, had locked humanity into a dynamic equilibrium with forces that do not forgive imbalance. The Emperor's role was not to end the struggle, but to mediate it. And mediation is only possible while both sides perceive benefit. Even faith began to misalign. The Imperial creed spread faster than reason ever could, saturating human worlds of devotion, so intense it altered the warp's psychic tides. This should have empowered the Emperor. In many ways, it did. But belief is not a one-way current. It amplifies. It reflects. And in some regions, manifestations attributed to the Emperor bore qualities that did not match any known vision sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. Not demonic. Not holy. Simply unfamiliar. These incidents were suppressed aggressively, their witnesses re-educated or eliminated. Faith must remain legible to be controlled. The most dangerous sign was subtle exhaustion, not of armies or populations, but of momentum itself. Crusades required greater effort for diminishing returns. Victories felt temporary, reversible. The Imperium advanced only to stabilize, never to resolve. This was not decay. It was maintenance on a galactic scale. A holding pattern enforced by systems that resisted change as aggressively as they resisted collapse. The signs did not culminate in revelation. They accumulated, like stress fractures in adamantium, invisible until the moment they are everywhere at once. Those who lived close to the warp felt it as a change in texture rather than threat. Navigators described currents that no longer flowed but pressed, as if the Imperium itself had grown denser around the Astronomican's beam. Astropaths began to report that focusing on the Emperor's light felt less like reaching toward guidance and more like bracing against resistance. The light was still there, but it pushed back. In the outer reaches of Imperial space, entire systems experienced what administratum scribes would later classify as temporal drag. Communications arrived late, without explanation. Reinforcements emerged from the warp weeks behind schedule, despite clean jumps. Supplies spoiled in transit, not from sabotage, but from subtle chronological inconsistencies that defied standard causality. None of these incidents were catastrophic on their own. Together, they painted a picture of a galaxy where reality itself was growing reluctant to cooperate. The Imperium responded the only way it knew how: escalation. More psykers were fed to the Golden Throne. More prayer cycles were mandated. More tides were extracted to sustain a system whose internal logic no longer aligned with its outward results. Each escalation produced short-term stabilization followed by deeper instability, as if the system were correcting for interference rather than benefiting from reinforcement. This pattern should have been alarming. Instead, it became routine. Crisis followed by ritual. Ritual followed by relief. Relief followed by decay. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, a minority of magi began to speak in the language of closed systems. They argued, in carefully encoded terms, that the throne and the Astronomican form a loop rather than a source. Energy entered, but it also exited, redistributed in ways that could not be traced to any Imperial endpoint. Their calculations suggested dissipation not into the warp at large, but into a localized structure that behaved like a reservoir under pressure. These magi did not claim to know what the reservoir was. They only knew it was filling. The Inquisition encountered the same conclusion from a different direction. Certain radical Ordo Malleus operatives noticed that demonic incursions near key Astronomican routes behaved with unusual restraint. Instead of overwhelming defenses, they tested them. Instead of spreading corruption, they withdrew after achieving no obvious objective. This was not mercy. It was calibration. The implication was chilling. The warp was not assaulting the Imperium blindly. It was measuring it. Faith, too, began to show strain. In some worlds, devotion intensified to the point of psychic saturation, producing miracles that burned out entire populations in moments of ecstatic annihilation. In others, belief faltered inexplicably, leaving voids in the warp that attracted predatory entities with surgical precision. These fluctuations did not correlate with morality, obedience, or piety. They correlated with pressure, with thresholds being crossed and then corrected. At the center of all of it, the Emperor endured, not as a god dispensing judgment, but as a constant exertion of will against forces that had learned the limits of that will over millennia. If he had once shaped the terms of the Pact, He was now bound by them. His silence was not indifference. It was concentration stretched so thin that even a moment of distraction could unbalance the system. No official imperial text acknowledges the existence of a debt. The Imperium does not frame its survival in the language of obligation. It speaks instead of destiny, a divine mandate, of an emperor whose will alone keeps the darkness at bay. Yet beyond sanctioned doctrine, beyond the margins where scholars are allowed to speculate safely, the same idea reappears again and again under different names. Balance, counterweight, tithe. In the rare moments when these ideas are allowed to surface, they do so not as accusations, but as patterns that refuse to be ignored. Among the most dangerous circles of imperial thought, the Pact is never described as a single event. It is understood as a structure that persists through time, adjusting itself as conditions change. Those who reach this conclusion do not arrive there through faith or revelation. They arrive through exhaustion, after comparing centuries of anomalies that all point to the same uncomfortable principle. Nothing is being held back for free. The Emperor did not defeat the warp. He constrained it, and constraint implies ongoing cost. The ecclesiarchy, when forced to confront such ideas, reframes them as tests of faith. Suffering is sanctified. Sacrifice becomes proof of righteousness. But this interpretation fails to explain why suffering follows patterns that mirror mechanical regulation rather than moral consequence. Worlds are not punished for heresy alone. They are corrected when they destabilize the system. Entire populations vanish not as warnings, but as adjustments. The warp does not rage indiscriminately. It responds with precision that suggests awareness rather than chaos. Inquisitors who tread this path carefully notice something else. The entities encountered within the Imperium do not speak of the Emperor as an enemy. They speak of him as an obstruction, a boundary, something that occupies a position it was never meant to hold permanently. Demons lie by nature, but even lies reveal intent through consistency. Across interrogations separated by centuries and sectors, the same implication surfaces: that the Emperor's role is temporary, and that the universe remembers when terms are overdue. The most restrained interpretation frames the debt as metaphysical inertia. The Astronomican imposes order on a medium that resists it. That resistance accumulates. Every force corridor through the warp leaves distortion behind. Over millennia, those distortions coalesce into pressure that demands release. In this view, the Emperor's suffering is not punishment, but function. He is a release valve, bleeding off instability in controlled increments rather than allowing it to detonate catastrophically. More heretical interpretations go further. They suggest that the Pact was not made with the warp as a whole, but with something that exists beneath its turbulence. Not a god in traditional sense, but a regulatory intelligence that governs transition between states, life and death, order and dissolution, movement and stasis. Such an entity would not hate humanity. It would not care about humanity at all. It would care only about imbalance. And from its perspective, the Imperium is imbalance incarnate. In this framework, the Emperor is not merely bound to the Golden Throne. He is bound to a role that no human mind, however vast, can fulfill indefinitely. He stabilizes a system that wants to collapse into a different configuration. The debt accrues not because the entity is malevolent, but because the configuration persists beyond its natural span. The longer it is maintained, the greater the correction required when it finally fails. This is why the debt is never collected all at once. Sudden collapse would undo the value of the arrangement. Instead, it is harvested gradually, through psykers burned out in the throne circuits, through worlds erased in warp anomalies that never make it into public record, through souls lost in transit that are quietly written off as acceptable attrition. Each loss is small enough to rationalize. Together, they form a ledger no one's permitted to see in full. The Emperor's continued endurance complicates this further. As belief in him intensifies, his psychic presence grows more rigid. Worship fixes him into place, reinforcing the structure that demands his suffering. In this sense, faith becomes part of the trap. The Imperium believes it is empowering its savior. It may instead be preventing his release. The more the Emperor is treated as eternal, the less room there is for the system to resolve naturally. Some forbidden texts suggest that this was anticipated, that the Emperor, fully aware of the cost, chose imprisonment over extinction, believing that humanity would eventually mature beyond the need for the Pact. That belief now appears dangerously optimistic. The Imperium did not grow out of dependence. It ritualized it. The debt has not diminished. It has become institutional. Chapter 4 does not offer a villain to confront or a ritual to break the Pact. It offers something far more unsettling. The realization that the debt has a shape, and that shape is the Imperium itself. Every world bound by the Astronomican, every soul fed into the throne, every prayer reinforcing the Emperor's immobility contributes to a structure that cannot be dismantled without catastrophic release. The Pact was never meant to be broken dramatically. It was meant to expire, and the longer humanity refuses to let it end, the more severe the correction will be when it finally does. The Imperium does not fear endings. It fears interruption. Apocalypse can be ritualized, prophesied, even welcomed, but disruption of continuity is treated as the greatest heresy of all. This is why the slow failure of the Golden Throne is more terrifying than any single cataclysmic vision. It does not announce itself with fire or revelation. It manifests as hesitation, as delay, as systems that still function, but no longer forgive error. In the present age, the throne no longer behaves like a stable anchor. Its demands fluctuate unpredictably. Entire convoys of psykers are consumed with diminishing returns, their sacrifice producing less stabilization than the last. The Astronomican's light flickers not because it is failing outright, but because it is being modulated against pressures no longer fully contained. Navigators report moments where the beacon seems to recede, not dimming, but withdrawing, as if something between it and the warp is being stretched thinner than intended. These signs are not hidden. They are reframed. Every flicker becomes a test of faith. Every surge in sacrifice becomes proof of devotion. The Imperium doubles down on obedience because obedience is the only lever it believes it still controls. What it cannot acknowledge is that the Pact is no longer responding predictably. The feedback loop that once rewarded sacrifice with stability now returns diminishing certainty. This is not punishment. It is accounting. At the center of it all, the Emperor endures a role that was never meant to be eternal. His consciousness, once vast enough to shape destiny, is now distributed across a system that uses him as a constant counterforce. He is not merely holding the line. He is absorbing the accumulated imbalance of 10,000 years. The longer he remains bound, the more he becomes indistinguishable from the mechanism that imprisons him. Release, if it comes, will not be clean. Freedom at this scale has consequences. Some within the Imperium believe that apotheosis awaits him. That belief is comforting. It promises transcendence rather than reckoning. Others fear a different outcome, that when the Emperor can no longer maintain the Pact, he will not ascend but collapse, and the correction will propagate outward along every corridor he once held open. Warp routes will not simply close. They will invert. The Astronomican's light will not go out. It will cease to be singular, fracturing into incoherent reflections that lead nowhere safely. The most dangerous possibility is the quiet one, that the Pact will not end in fire or darkness, but in indifference, that the structure will simply relax, releasing pressures gradually as the Imperium loses cohesion piece by piece. Worlds will not vanish in explosions, but drift out of relevance, their connections severed one by one until humanity exists as scattered remnants, no longer worth correcting. Survival without unity, life without meaning, a species reduced not by conquest, but by expiration. If the Pact truly comes due, there may be no moment to resist it, no enemy to fight, no ritual to perform, only the consequences of a choice made in desperation long before anyone alive could remember it. The Emperor's greatest act may not have been uniting humanity, but buying it time, and time, once spent, cannot be reclaimed. This is the final heresy the Imperium cannot afford to consider. That the Emperor's silence is not a promise of eternal protection, but a reminder of a debt still being paid. That survival purchased through stasis carries its own form of extinction, and that the question facing humanity is not whether the Emperor will rise or fall, but whether the species he saved has grown strong enough to stand when the bargain finally ends. The Pact does not demand worship. It does not demand obedience. It demands resolution. And resolution, after 10,000 years of delay, will not ask permission,